Welcome to the City Club. We have three distinguished speakers. We will invite them up here right now. If all three of you gentlemen sit behind your name. Rick. All right. They'll be speaking in alphabetical order because we are a creative organization. The first speaker will be Marc Brown. Marc has been here before as a local news columnist, and he's also written about political corruption, family life, and obviously now sports. He has a great long resume. He's a graduate of Northern Illinois University. He's also attended the program at UIS, used to be Sangamon State, and he's been with many local newspapers, including the Quad City Times. Let's have a round of applause for Marc Brown. By the way, he's been with the paper since 1982. All right. 30 years. Did you get a pin?
No,
okay.
Nothing.
Mr. Kirk. All right, next up will be, after him will be Rick Morrissey, who's been with the Sun-Times since 2009, coming from the Tribune. As we discussed at the table, among the places he has worked is the Star Publications in the beautiful South Suburbs, which of course is a training ground for many great reporters. He also has written a book called Ozzie School of Management. I assume it's more than 50 pages, but we're just assuming that. And he went to Northwestern. And third, of course, we have Rick Telander, who's been with the paper since '95, coming from Sports Illustrated and ESPN, the magazine, and as we discussed at the table, was the young gun dealing with the famous sports writer show with Ben Bentley, who was a longtime family friend of my family. And Rick has written many articles and, of course, has gotten many awards, but working with Ben Bentley, obviously, everything else has basically been downward. So a big round of applause for Rick Telander, a survivor. So, by the way, air on the chairman. Before we start with Marc, you're up first. Remember KUKD. I'd like to introduce a member of the Board of Trustees from Roosevelt University, Charlie Gardner, Iowa All-American. Maybe not, but close enough. By the way, if you want to know what KUKD means, Kraft, I will be happy to tell you what those initials mean because it really works in politics as it does in public life. So Marc, you got kiss up, kick down. That's basically what it means. Mr. Donovan nodded his head. Okay, Marc, you're up first. 5 to 8 minutes on whatever you want to talk about.
A lot of people ask me, what are you doing on this panel with the sports guys? Fair question. The short answer, the boss asked me to do it. He thought maybe I could talk about stuff like stadium financing, which I do follow a little bit on the news side. But a lot of folks may not realize that before I started my gig as a news columnist for the Sun-Times, I did a year in the sports department. The plan was for me to be a sports investigative reporter, but I was so lost on the job that I expanded it to do sports business as well, just to try to be a little more productive. The main thing I learned from that experience is that every guy thinks he knows about sports. But whether you believe it or not, the real sports writers who do it for a living know a lot more about sports than even the most avid fans. My point being that I was not a real sports writer and am no expert like these guys, and I'm not going to try to pretend to be one. One of my early assignments on the sports beat was getting sent down to the University of Kentucky, where a former Northwestern football player who had participated in the points shaving scandal was giving a presentation for the NCAA. I thought I was going to have a big scoop, but when I got down there, I ran into smack dab into the reporter for the Tribune who was already there, which was when I first met Mr. Morrissey here. So no scoop, and he probably outwrote me as well. But I did get a chance to get better acquainted with the then very little known federal prosecutor on that point shaving case, Patrick Collins, who went on to handle a few cases that some of you here might remember a little better, like a certain governor who's about to get out of prison. I go back a lot further with Telander, although he wouldn't know it. When I was a kid growing up in the Peoria area, and still in grade school, I'll say, Rick was the star athlete at Peoria Richwood High School. I remember following his exploits in the Peoria Journal-Star. I also can still remember opening up my Sports Illustrated years later and finding the first-person story he wrote about his training camp experience after being drafted by the Kansas City Chiefs. It didn't seem fair that a guy could be that good an athlete and that good a writer, too. So down to business. I was going to say we've got kind of a unique situation here with several major stadium projects in the works at the same time, but the truth is it usually seems to work out that way. Because when one team owner starts sniffing around for a deal, the others try to get ready with a plan of their own, either so that they can get in on the action or to block the other guy. The big news this past weekend was that the Cubs have revealed their latest plans for renovating Wrigley Field. And much to everyone's surprise, at least to mine, they say they aren't looking for any sort of public financing anymore. Up until now, the Cubs under the Ricketts ownership had been floating a plan to finance the renovation with money that the city and county would forego from any future increase in amusement taxes generated by the ballpark. It's kind of along the same lines as these tax increment financing deals. Now, responding to all the complaints from the editorial boards and from those of us who say the team ought to be able to pay for any improvements on its own, the Cubs are saying, fine, we'll do that, but you have to untie our hands about what we can do with the ballpark to generate revenue. That means more signage, more night games, more concerts and special events, and they'd also like the city to allow them to use Sheffield Avenue on game days for shops and such. The Cubs say most of the money to make this work comes from the signage. The catch, of course, is that they want to put the signs up above the back of the bleachers, which would conflicts with the sight lines from the rooftops, who have become a very powerful lobby over the years. And obviously a lot of people like them too. Personally, I find the idea very intriguing. While I think the Cubs ought to preserve the character of Wrigley Field, I think they deserve more freedom in how they go about that. If we're going to tie their hands and tell them to treat Wrigley Field like a living history museum, then eventually we're probably going to have to need to put some public money into the place. I like this better. I don't think the city needs to give them carte blanche on night games and concerts, but we can certainly do a lot to open that up more. The fact of the matter is that Wrigley Field is a tremendous tourism asset that's in danger of falling down, and fixing it up for the next 30 years is in the public interest. As Fran Spielman, who is the Sun-Times real stadium expert, explains in today's paper, the eventual solution will probably require the Cubs and the rooftop owners to strike some kind of compromise, with the Cubs getting the revenue from signs that would go maybe up on the rooftops. An interesting part of the play here is that by giving up on the public financing, the Cubs have removed their need to get anything done in Springfield, which, you know, is difficult these days. This way, they really have just had one person to convince the mayor, and maybe some of the people at this table too, who has shown himself to be more receptive to their needs than Mayor Daley, who is a Sox fan, always seemed to like to stick the needle to the Cubs, especially during the Tribune ownership. I also think he's willing to allow, he's less willing than Mayor Daley was to allow the alderman up there, Tom Tunney, to stand in the way. The other big stadium deal in the works doesn't directly involve any of our pro sports teams, but instead one of our universities, DePaul, which is apparently in line to get a publicly subsidized stadium built by the Metropolitan Pier and Exposition Authority. Now this one has really got me honked off, in part because I just don't understand why we'd be putting public funds into another arena at this time, but also because nobody will come right out and explain what they've got planned or how they're going to pay for it. They're trying to get the deal all their ducks in order before they float it out there. As far as anybody has been able to put together, we're talking about a substantial facility of at least 12,000 seats that would probably cost upwards of $200 million. DePaul would put up part of that money, maybe $75 million, and retain some sort of naming rights. But the rest would be financed with McPier bonds that are repaid with hotel and restaurant taxes. You know, some people don't consider that real taxpayers' money because it comes out of, theoretically, tourists. But it's public money, it's public financing. It's clear the mayor is in favor of some version of this, but is holding off saying so publicly for reasons I don't quite understand. We're told that such an arena would be an asset for conventions in McCormick Place, but not a cost-effective one. And we're also told they want to do this to drive commercial development around McCormick Place to make the neighborhood more attractive to conventioneers. I think if the economy comes back, that neighborhood will get there on its own. Jerry Reinsdorf is fighting hard to keep this arena from being built. He's gone so far as to extend an invite to DePaul to play rent-free at the United Center. As you might guess, this has nothing to do with basketball or ice hockey or any other sport. This is about music concerts. The United Center doesn't want to have to compete with another concert venue in town. Now, the United Center has its own development deal on the board, also having little or nothing to do with sports. They want they've got a $100 million plan to build a restaurant and entertainment complex on the east side of the United Center, a little like what I think they're envisioning down at McCormick Place. All they want to do that is to extend a little known and even less understood property tax break that they receive that is scheduled to expire in a few years. That property tax break has saved them tens of millions of dollars in real estate taxes since the United Center was built. Then we've got what's going on at the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority, the landlord for the White Sox and the issuer of the bonds for Soldier Field. That's where the mayor and the governor got into a major tussle over who gets to run the place. A lot of the focus has been attention has been focused on the White Sox and their very advantageous lease deal. But the real problem there is with the Soldier Field deal. There's a real danger over the next decade, I'm told, that the backloaded schedule for retiring the bonds is going to exceed the hotel tax dollars being generated for that purpose, which will put Chicago taxpayers directly on the hook. All in all, it makes you better appreciate the Cubs saying they're willing to fix up Wrigley Field on their own.
Well, very good. And you folks thought we were talking sports, huh? Okay, Mr. Morrissey, you're up next.
I'd like to talk about Manti Te'o, if that's okay. I'm sure you've all.
Sports story.
Yes, I'm sure you've all heard the story. It's the boy meets girl, typical boy meets girl, girl doesn't actually exist story. And I actually found a way to tie this into to public policy. So I was just thinking, on the way over here, how great it would be if we all had a virtual friend. How much easier life would be if we had a special somebody. And I thought, well, Tom Ricketts, for example, the owner of the Cubs, he's trying to get a stadium, and what if he made an impassioned plea to taxpayers, and he held a press conference and said, we want a stadium, we want a renovated stadium, but before I get started on that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my friend Fred, who is he's 100 years old. And unfortunately, had some bad news last week. He's told by doctors he has cancer and he has 1 year left to live. And so I said to Fred, you have 1 year to live. What would you like to do? What would you like to see happen in your year? And Fred looked at me. Well, actually, he emailed me, but he said. More than anything, I would like the Cubs to be able to renovate their stadium. and not just that, have fabulous taxpayer-funded skyboxes, if that would be okay. And so I said, me being Tom Ricketts, you don't want a World Series? You don't want a World Series victory? Wouldn't that appeal to you? And Fred said, that's just fantasy. Come on, that's never going to happen. Now a jumbotron in center field, a big jumbotron, that would really work. Anyway, I think taxpayers would go crazy for that. I think Mark would agree with that plan. I do want to talk about the Te'o story a little bit. And we sports writers have really been taking a pounding lately for the story, and rightfully so. I think for not being on the story quite as doggedly as we should. Why didn't anybody look up an obituary? Or when they couldn't find an obituary, why didn't they stop and say something? Why, when Sports Illustrated called Stanford University to ask about Lene Kekua, the volleyball player who Manti Te'o said he was a boyfriend with, why did they have no record of her at the school? You know, where you think red flags would go up right away. And I'd like to think that if I were in that position, I might have stopped right in my tracks. The fact is, I don't know. I don't know if I would have. But let's step back a second and go back to the beginning of this story. If you remember, Manti Te'o tells a reporter or reporters, my grandmother died and my girlfriend died of leukemia on the same day. And I think, so as a journalist, you say, wow, that's an unbelievable story. So Manti Te'o sits down with several reporters and describes what happens. At least one reporter said to him, hey, could I get a phone number for her family? I'd love to talk to her parents. You know, this is an incredible story. What happened with you? You were on the phone with her all the time. You really helped her through this. You were with her. Manti Te'o says to the reporter, you know, the family's still grieving, and they're really having a hard time with this. I'd really appreciate if you could respect their privacy at this time. Well, what would you do? I think most people would say, yeah, okay, you know, I mean, I understand that. The second thing is that Manti Te'o's father sat across the table with a South Bend Tribune reporter and described in detail his son's first meeting with the girlfriend. So, okay, let's say you were a little suspicious that Manti didn't want you to talk to the family. It struck you as a little odd. But here you have Manti's father describing pretty clearly what happened. I think you'd feel a little relieved and say, okay, I might have felt uneasy that it's just coming from one person, but here it's from somebody else. But the other thing that stands out is this is the most celebrated player in college football in the country. You have absolutely no reason to not believe him. And he's playing for the most celebrated school in the country in terms of football and education. And so, you know, I've been trying to make a defense, and it's very difficult, but I've tried to put myself in the seat of the people who wrote these stories and did these things and didn't do enough. And it's hard, and I don't really have a good one other than, you know, maybe put yourself in their shoes. Doesn't make it right, but that's what happened. The other thing I would say about this story, Deadspin.com broke the story and did a really, for the most part, did a really good job with the details in finding out and digging and finding out what happened here. But what's not talked about much is the fact that they were tipped to this story. Somebody called them who knew about the hoax, called them and said, hey, you might want to dig into this. There's something not right about this story about Manti Te'o's girlfriend. Whoever that source was also called ESPN. They were looking into the story as well. They were slower to get to it. So I think it's important to say, you know, there was something that started that story in the same way that there was something that started the Watergate story. If there's not a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, if there's not people arrested, there's not a Watergate story, probably. There's not a Woodward and Bernstein as we know it. And that's not to say there was unbelievable reporting that went on, but sometimes there has to be something to start that rock rolling down the road. You know, we've also, I think Rick can attest to this, we've also gotten a lot of criticism. Where were we during the steroids era of baseball? Where was the media? And why weren't reporters asking questions of Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens? They were asking questions. The information didn't start coming out about guilty parties, actually, or more evidence until there was a congressional committee asking questions of these athletes. And some, like our own Sammy Sosa, suddenly couldn't remember how to speak English, if you recall. So a lot of people didn't want to answer. Lance Armstrong, another example. There were a lot of reporters after him. There were a lot of reporters trying to figure things out, trying to dig and get the story. They came up short. But then federal prosecutors started, under subpoena, asking other riders about drug use. And under oath, they told the truth. So yes, I guess I am making some excuses here, but sometimes these stories need a little help to get going, it's difficult sometimes. But I'll say this, that this is a really important moment for us in the sports writing community, I think, and I think if there was any time that you sat down to do a story and you weren't questioning things, well, I think now you are in almost any circumstance. I can think of stories, even just, Mark probably has been in the same situation where you're even asking a fan or you're asking somebody on the street and they give you their name and they give you their age. You have no idea if that's really that person. Maybe they're playing a prank on somebody. So I'm not sure how to answer that part of it yet. But we're all going to have to be a lot more conscientious about about getting to the bottom of things. So the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Rick is just that technology today is so amazing, and this thing that Manti Te'o got caught up in. And I was thinking about, just how easy kids have it these days. If you think about it, like if you're dating a girl in high school, you never have to call home. You never have to call her home. You don't have to worry about her father picking up the phone. There's no dread. There's no dread there. You don't have to come to the door. You can pull up in the car and say, text, I'm here, and never have to face the parents. You can break up with her over the phone too. You can say it's not you, it's me by sending an email, which is pretty cool. But the excellent part about Manti Te'o is that you don't even need a girlfriend anymore. That's the story behind this. So anyway, that's my spiel. I'll pass it over to my buddy.
Rick Telander, but wait a second, for a second I thought you were doing an AT&T commercial. Okay, quick line. Rick Telander, you're batting cleanup. Bring us together. Uh-oh. Show and tell. All right, this is it. High tech.
I'm a big show and tell kind of guy.
Yeah, here we go.
The show and tell is when I first started feeling comfortable in speaking in front of people. It was about first grade, I guess. So I like to have things. We'll get to that in a second. Just to answer two things that made me think about it. As sports writers, we're going to have to ask people if we can see their social security number of your girlfriend, your dog, your grandmother. Manti Te'o has changed things forever, I believe, because the one question that was never asked, or reasonably never asked, was, is this girlfriend real? And the whole concept of what real is now has taken on a whole new meaning. The other thing, to answer Marc Brown, where he said it wasn't fair that somebody be so athletically gifted and such a great writer as I. It only took me 24 years to make it to the Sun-Times, and Hank Stram gladly issued me out of Kansas City Chiefs camp and said, time to get on with the rest of your life. So much for that. I'd like to thank the City Club, and I'd like to thank the power table right over here with Craig and Chris and Jim Kirk, the guys who run the Sun-Times. A lot of friends I see out here. George Lucas, not the entertainer, or not the movie guy, but the Cubby Bear, getting a new hip, so let's have a big hand for him. Wherever it is. George, good luck with that hip. It's a piece of cake. Okay, so show and tell. I happened to be looking down in my basement last night, which I do quite often because it's very odd what is collected down there after living in the same house for 29 years, and things just get stacked up. I happened to come upon a folder of mine when I was looking to move some boxes, and this is a story that I wrote for Sports Illustrated in 1981, and I was fascinated by the way that I actually got my information. It came in from stringers across the country writing out 10, 15-page reports that were sent to Eleanor Milosevic at Sports Illustrated, who would then send them to me because we didn't have any other way to get them. It was before the internet. Hundreds of pages here coming up to, this is all about our sports athletes and writers getting along, and it's never been worse. This was 30-some years ago, very prophetic. Only the point I'm making then is that it can't possibly get worse than the way things are now. One of the pitchers who had, it was Bert Blyleven, and he'd stopped talking to reporters, and they asked him why. And he said, because of the really critical article that you wrote 3 or 4 days ago. And the writer said it was the one in which he had said that Blyleven had blown leads in 4 of the last 5 games, blown the games in which he had leads. And Blyleven said, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And the writer said, well, what do you mean? He said, 1 run, 2 runs, you call that a lead? So anyway, I was fascinated by that. I was also fascinated by the incredibly primitive technology. I wrote my story for Sports Illustrated in longhand, a pencil, and then I had somebody type it up. Then we move along with technology where it has become, as Rick was implying, pretty much everything for us. We're not necessarily a newspaper anymore. We are an information service, and we have brands, the Sun-Times, but we're also competing now with the citizen journalist, which can be anybody at any time, anybody that goes to a sporting event. What we have to have is credence, and this Manti Te'o story and the Lance Armstrong story, which has broken. If any of you took the time to watch the entire Oprah interview, which I did, is very telling about technology, about the future of writing, and about honesty, and about what it is that drives our greatest athletes. And what Armstrong said, Oprah, in her gentle way, used 2.5 hours to get out of him what I think I could have gotten in 15 minutes, which is basically you cheated your entire career, we don't care about much else. Why? What were your motivations? How did you think you were going to get away with it, etc.? Because he did cheat the entire way, and perhaps even gave himself his testicular cancer from all the drugs that he took. But he said when it really got hairy, when it really got serious, was when 11 writers were brought in, and he said these people had badges and guns and subpoena power. That's the one thing we don't have. When it came to the Baseball Hall of Fame this year and no one was elected, you had a bunch of writers trying to decide what to do with players whom they assume are dirty. Some of them actually are and have been proven, have been found to be, have used performance-enhancing drugs when they were illicit, illegal, and they were always cheating. So what do? We don't have subpoena power. I can't go into a locker room and say, I want to give you a urine test, or I can't see a player out at night and say, I want to get, I'd like a little sample of blood. So we're lagging behind, and if we're not careful, we can be sued. One of the guys who was ahead of the story about Lance Armstrong, David Walsh, who was a British journalist, very brave one, he was sued by Lance Armstrong, even though Armstrong and his attorneys knew that what David Walsh said was 100% true. He was not only sued, he lost. And they had to pay $500,000 or £500,000 or whatever to Lance Armstrong for printing what was the truth. Very, very dangerous area that we're in. In 1996, I wrote about a woman who was the wonderful story of the Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Michelle Smith, who eventually became Michelle Smith de Bruin. She was a swimmer from Ireland. She was short. She was she wasn't tan. She didn't look like a typical California swimmer. And there were guys in green jackets running around from Ireland, and they were so happy and thrilled and desperate for the joy that this brought to their country. There wasn't even a 50-meter pool in the whole country of Ireland, they were telling me. And I looked at her, and I thought, how did this happen? How did you drop 12 seconds in the individual medley? I knew enough about swimming, having swum as a kid and having had children of my own who were swimmers, and I was just thinking, you can't do this. Well, I wrote that she had a dirty little family and they had a dirty little secret, and that she was now dating and had married a guy named De Bruin from the Netherlands who had been a shot putter who was banned from Olympic competition from taking drugs. In the mail, about a few months later, comes a lawsuit from Ireland suing me for defamation and other things. And Nigel Wade was then the managing editor of the Sun-Times, and we had to be very careful to see, was I truly going to be sued? Was this a dangerous threat that I was going to have to try to prove something that I was incapable of proving without subpoena power? As it turned out, they felt that they had jurisdiction because it went out over the internet. This was very early on, and that made it an international story. We wrote back and responded that we didn't believe that, and the thing kind of died, and eventually Michelle Smith would flunk a drug test so badly that her urine sample was filled halfway with Irish whiskey. And that's
shocking,
true.
right there. That's right, Marty.
Irish whiskey, not bourbon, but Irish whiskey. So anyway, there's a great danger in these stories. It's very fascinating for us too, because we have become sort of the arbiters of justice and morality, something that we never perhaps thought we would do. I look back on my career, 40 years. It's basically what I've done: write about cheaters, and then have to go back and say that they are not the champions we thought they were. Ben Johnson, Marion Jones, the baseball players, on and on, from Barry Bonds, all the way up to perhaps the greatest fraud, I believe the greatest fraud in athletics of all time, which is Lance Armstrong, who has won nothing, who has no pennants, no yellow jerseys, no Tour de France victories, nothing, who has been dirty for 20 years. And the other thing that Oprah got out of him was like, how did you think you were going to get away with this? Because he'd already established the kind of personality he had, that he said, I'm a bully, I take no prisoners, I will never say that I'm not going to win. This is exactly the kind of character that had been described by Tyler Hamilton and Greg LeMond and so many other great riders, bicyclists. They described his personality, and he agreed. And he said, the way I thought I was going to get away with it was I thought it would just be an argument and a debate forever, and I'd be accused forever, but nobody would ever prove it. He didn't mind being shamed. That was irrelevant to winning. So we got an insight into what it takes to be a champion. I was in Athens, Greece, for the great Olympics that went back there in 2000. It was 2004, excuse me. And they held the shot put event back at the ancient site of Olympus, where the gods had been when the first Olympics were held, in this beautiful rolling hills with olive trees and the ruins of ancient Greek civilization. And the shot putters came out and they marched through the ruins, and it was just magnificent. It made the hair on your arm stand up when you thought of antiquity and the way that sports binds humanity together. And the two shot putters who won, it would take a long time, including just about a few months ago, the female and the male, both, of course, were cheaters and had their gold medals taken away. So how do we identify with that? And one of the ways we do it is we try to remain, as my colleague and buddy Rick Morrissey says, skeptical. Not cynical to the point that we don't believe anything, but if you're not skeptical in sports writing, you're a fool. But that brings me back around to my show and tell. I love show and tell. This is a Sun-Times delivery truck, scale model from the old days when delivering newspapers was really, really important. I got this from Neil Steinberg. It was in his office. He's one of our writers. I think you all know who he is.
He's been here.
I traded him. I had to have it. I mean, I had to have this. It rolls. It's got doors that open. I mean, whatever. And Neil said, take it. Just take it. He saw this Gollum-like desire for the one ring. I gave him an American League Baseball and a National League Baseball in exchange, which he didn't even want. But this thing, I loved it so much that I even made little bound newspapers with string, and it filled up the back end of it. This is an adult, a man who was almost 60 years old. At any rate, it now holds something very special in the back of it, and I'd like to see what that is. This takes us back to the Olympics this summer in London, and you'd be amazed at what might be in here. And they pulled out, lo and behold, stuffed in there with, I guess the truck's, why, it's Wenlock. And Wenlock is a symbol of the Olympics. One of the most pitiful renditions of a happy little mascot, some frightening cyclops with things around its ears, its arms. This was given by me to my compatriot, Rick Morrissey, for his birthday in England. horrified him to such an extent that when I was in the hospital recently getting both my knees replaced, he brought it to me to help me get better. And I'd like to give it back to Rick so he can put it where it goes, in his office. That's all I have to say.
Okay, well done. That is really a nice truck, by the way. Okay, let's go. We have more. Get City Club E in here. If you have questions, raise your hand. We have a few. City Club E will be happy to walk around. That's Ernestina. Something for you. Oh, another. We're getting some early returns. Okay. Joe Lambie, this is no, Joe Lambus, I'm sorry. This is toss-up. This sounds like a quiz show. No. What is the relationship between sportsmanship and performance-enhancing drugs? Within 25 words, because we covered a lot of it. Anyone jump up?
There is no relationship. I mean, I don't know what it would be. I mean, if you're taking performance-enhancing drugs, I think you've severed the tie there to sportsmanship, because if you were a sportsman-like athlete, you would be doing it on the up and up, I think.
I'll say very swiftly that whatever you may think about performance-enhancing drugs, through my entire career, I've never had one athlete who was proud to have used them or would admit openly to having used them, ever.
Okay. We have two questions on the same topic. One from Linda Foreman, who I believe works for the Sun-Times. Where are you, Linda? Raise your hand. Okay. I know a lot of people want to be associated with the Sun-Times. I understand that. And we have Rachel Goldstein, who is a City Club member. Basically, Title IX is over 40 years old. Will it take another act of Congress to have press coverage of women's sports? And the mysterious question is, how can women's professional sports teams get better coverage and interest in attendance? Don't jump at once.
Well,
Go, Rick.
I'm not sure. Look, this is the way I think about it, and it might not be the answer you want, but we look at it as how we cover sports is how many people show up to the games, and it's not our job to boost up sports, and whether that's female or male. Rick has a son who plays lacrosse, collegiate lacrosse. That sport is hardly covered at all. So that's sort of our criteria, and I've had arguments back and forth with a lot of people. I've written columns about it, and I'm not going to feel guilty about not writing about women's soccer if I don't see that there's that much interest in it, and I'm not going to be guilted into writing about it. And so if the sport can stand on its own, then okay. But what is Congress going to pass a law that says we have to be at games that we don't want to be at? I just don't see it. Or if we do, Telander is going to be there.
But Mark?
Oh,
Yeah.
they haven't made me the sports editor, man. I don't have to answer them. I've wrestled with that through the years, but I come down the same place. I don't see the interest. There's not great demand for us to write about, what's the latest professional basketball team's name? I can't even remember.
The Sky.
The Sky. Sorry.
I would say, I would agree with Rick and Mark. I think there are women's sports that are in demand. Women's figure skating, during the Olympics, many women's sports, diving, swimming, I think is almost as, with Missy Franklin, was almost as exciting as watching Ryan Lochte and Michael Phelps. I would also say women's tennis. I would far prefer to watch the Williams sisters or watch women's tennis rather than men just serving 150 miles an hour and getting ace after ace. So the cart can't be in front of the horse. And when, it's a tough nut, but not everything can be covered and not everything can be exciting to the masses.
Okay. You all don't have to answer because we have a lot of questions, and some of these look like real sandbag questions. This is really good because this is the City Club. Tom Leahy, where are you? Raises his hand. Remember that last name. Did you know about McGuire University? This is legit. Tom, or if you had, would you have revealed the hoax? What's McGuire University?
I know what it is.
All right, Rick, you're up.
Do you guys?
I don't know what it is.
It was a bunch of drunks who hung out with Al McGuire, I think. Well, it was here in Chicago, right? And it was had to do with Marquette guys or something like that, right? Not drunks. I didn't mean that. I meant socializers.
We got the picture. Go ahead. No need to backpedal.
Was I close? McGuire's Tavern.
Marty McLaughlin knows. Okay.
An Irish tavern. I don't get it. That's a joke.
They made up a letterhead and they wrote it in and they asked for tickets for the NCAA finals for years. And they gave it to them for years. They got it.
What a great story.
It's a great scam. Congratulations.
Tom, that's good. That's what makes this club great. Anyone? Okay, let's move on. That's tremendous. There are 80% of the people in this room are wishing they'd have thought of it. Okay. Real quick, lightning round from Joe Hammerschlag. How good a coach is Tom Thibodeau? 1 to 10. 10 being the greatest coach of all time, 1 being just a flop. 1 to 10.
I'll give him an 8.
Huh?
I said 8.
Oh, you just want a number?
Yeah.
Well, I'd give him a 9 or even a 10 if he doesn't kill his players first, because he runs them hard.
Mark?
I love Thibodeau, and I also, I'd say he's a 9 or 10 in the regular season, but this whole thing of where everybody's worn down, I think he's going to have to adapt at some point.
Okay. Joe, we normally don't do this, but another quick question, yes or no. Should Pete Rose be in the Hall of Fame? Yes or no?
No.
Yes. After he dies.
Oh, wait a second. That's worse punishment than if...
It is, but, you know, that's what's going to happen with the steroids, guys. They'll be in 25 years.
I'd say yes with an asterisk. If you can't have that, then no.
Okay. All right. Mike McIntyre. That's close. Close enough. Baird Warner Real Estate. How has the 24-hour sports TV affected good reporting? Good question.
It's made it easier in that we can always turn on the TV and find out what's going on, but so can everybody else. And what we have as sports writers is access with our press passes, and it means we have to be even more insightful when we use those. If we actually get into the locker room, there's cameras everywhere, and now people are actually using their smartphones to broadcast. So you don't need a giant thing over your shoulder and a big boom mic. Anybody that gets the access you do can get the same thing you do. So we have to work a little harder, although the information, I think, is also easier, the basic information, easier for us to get.
Okay. That's you don't have to respond. This is from board member Ed Mazer. Once the Ricketts and the Te'o story are played out, what about the culpability or the import of Notre Dame and its athletic director in its defense of Mr. Te'o?
You know, we're going to have to look into that because so Notre Dame does its own investigation of this thing and rushes that apparently the investigation lasted like 2 days, and it wasn't very thorough, and they came up with the idea that Manti Te'o was innocent and he was a victim of a hoax, which may be the truth. I don't know. It just seemed very fast. So I think there's going to be a lot of attention on Notre Dame during this. I mean, I understand their need to want to back the kid, and he's a 21-year-old kid. Everybody makes mistakes. We still don't know all the answers to what happened here, but that type of investigation, which really wasn't, just doesn't cut it, I don't think, for a major university like that.
I'd like to say, being a Heisman voter, that the entire process became very, very deceptive. And I believe that the Queen for a Day kind of thing, the sympathy vote, is real in that you think about what an athlete has to overcome. And I talked to Manti Te'o at Notre Dame's Southern Cal game out at the Coliseum in Los Angeles. And even then, well, that was the last game of the season. I won't say even then, but at that point, it was very much a dramatic moment for him when somebody said, one of the writers were in a little scrum in the tunnel, you know, what was the biggest down moment for you this season? And he immediately said September 12th and hinted that it was because his girlfriend and his grandmother died. I voted him first on my ballot ahead of Johnny Football Manziel, who I loved as a quarterback. Somebody asked me last night who went to Purdue University, doesn't like Notre Dame, and I think it's irrelevant whether you like the school or you don't like it. But he said to me, Rick, did anybody ever think this might be about money? And I said, what do you mean? He said, how much do you think a Heisman Trophy is worth to Notre Dame? And I started to think about it. Millions and millions of dollars in goodwill, in future earnings, in recruiting power. It's almost to bring up that golden ring from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it's almost that one cherished thing that you can't purchase, but its value is incalculable. And so, as simple and as naive as this kid may be, and as banal as his story might be, the repercussions of it could have been huge. He finished second in the Heisman Trophy voting. I'm not sure exactly how close the vote was, but he got my vote partly because of what I thought he had to overcome. And just to take it back a ways, I graduated in 1971 from in college, and at that time, running for the Heisman were three great quarterbacks: Joe Theismann, Archie Manning, and Jim Plunkett. And Theismann, Notre Dame's PR market was putting out all this stuff about Joe Theismann and, you know, just blizzarding the press with it. And I knew this even though I was still in college. But Jim Plunkett was a minority. He was of Mexican descent, and both of his parents were blind. And he won the Heisman. And that was the first time I felt, okay, we're going beyond what's on the football field. We're taking something that is this person's personality. And I want to ask you, you think there was not one person at Notre Dame high up, whether it was Swarbrick, whether it was Kelly the coach, somebody who didn't think or say, damn, this fake girlfriend is a great story?
Oh, you got to be really, I mean, well, I'm as cynical as they come. I mean, I don't believe.
I don't think they made it up, but when it transpired and when they knew, Notre Dame knew about it for a long time before they even let it go on to TV for the national championship game.
Yeah, because I agree with that, and it's obvious that happened. But it's, you know, we've seen with Penn State that you know, people will protect organizations and to ridiculous ends, but that reason, I mean, I think Notre Dame's very sensitive about its place in the world, and I don't think it wants to mess that up. I could see that. I don't think they care about you know, winning the Heisman trophies.
I thought you were a skeptic.
I am a skeptic, but I'm a skeptic in other areas. You know, there's other ways they could have been wrong and complicit in this thing about the Heisman Trophy. That just doesn't ring true to me.
Okay, well, not as you agree. Let's. We're going into OT. Seldom done at the City Club, but we got no more questions. We got some real good ones coming up, and then we'll just end it. So give us around another 8 minutes. This is from former State Senator Bill Marovitz. Now that the offense is being taken care of, somewhat optimistic, Mr. Marovitz, by the new coach, what about the aging defense on the Chicago Bears? What needs to be done?
Mark, you want to handle this?
I told you I was.
Come on, Mark.
The sports
Mark,
expert.
you watch
but
games.
yeah, I think they're just like Billy Marovitz thinks. I think they're too old. We're going to have trouble next year. We're going to have trouble next year. So, but we're going to have so much offense that it's going to make up for it.
Would you bring back Urlacher?
I wouldn't bring back Urlacher. I think he's worn down. I think it's a worn down defense that got the most out of what it was this year, and also and I'm not saying that Charles Tillman isn't great at what he does, but that type of forcing turnovers, that doesn't happen consistently like it did in the first half. So there was no way they were going to keep that going throughout the whole season. So I think they were really fortunate that way. And then when that stopped, you saw what happened. So you got some old guys in that defense, and I'm just really tired I was really tired of Lovey, obviously, and I was kind of tired of the team. So I wouldn't mind seeing it mixed up a little bit, some new people.
Rick Morrissey was not going to be complete as a human being until Lovie Smith left Chicago. I'm correct, right?
I think that's a little harsh, Rick.
Okay.
But
anyway, my feeling is when Rod Marinelli left as defensive coordinator to take actually a lower job with the Dallas Cowboys, he's now defensive line coach. I think that was pretty telling. And yeah, the defense is aging. I think it'd be sad if Brian Urlacher goes off as aging Hall of Famers do and starts playing here and there and gets injured and plays a few games, whatever. I wish there could be some kind of dramatic farewell for him at the 50-yard line at Soldier Field and say goodbye, but that'll never happen. I'm sure it'll be a kind of sad disappearance, as it almost always is for great athletes.
Okay, this is we only got 3 more questions. This is an anonymous question, which I normally would not repeat, but it's a very good question, so therefore, as always, we break the rules. Do you think the 2014 Hall of Fame class for baseball, will Greg Maddux and Frank Thomas be able to get in, and will that be the redemption of the Hall of Fame vote because no one got in this year?
Who's the second person?
Greg Maddux and Frank Thomas.
Well, I think they both should get in, and I think they should be in right away. And Maddux will get in right away. I'm not quite as convinced that Frank Thomas will, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. This is an incredible numbers, and he's a huge guy. If you've ever seen him, obviously he's huge, and no one really questions him on steroids, and I don't think there's any reason to. That there's no suggestion in anything he's done. But usually you look at size, and that's really not happened with him. But I really hope they both get in, and I don't think anybody really felt good about nobody getting in, but it was a real reflection of the steroid age, and all of us feeling this wasn't right. I mean, it casts a shadow on everybody, fair or unfair. But I think you'd be an idiot not to look at somebody's accomplishments without looking at through that prism of the steroids era. But I really hope both guys get in this time.
Any disagreement?
No, I think the writers are very stingy about first ballot guys, but they'll both get in. I guarantee both Maddux and Thomas will get in. When, I don't know. This year there's a Hall of Fame ceremony, if you can imagine, going to Cooperstown, and there's no live inductees. We got to get it straight. The Baseball Writers Association of America has got to come up with some concept of what to do about the steroid era, because these guys are just going to continue coming, and there's some great players out there. This year, Bagwell, Biggio, Bonds, I mean, it's just, McGuire's not getting anything. It's kind of crazy. And so if we don't come up with an asterisk, or we don't come up with some kind of concept to say, okay, at this point, from here on, we're not certain about these players, then how do we know Frank Thomas was clean? How do we know, Jim Thome is clean, he's country strong. Oh, really? What the hell does that mean? Because he came from Peoria, where I'm from? We're making uneducated guesses about who used performance-enhancing drugs, and we got to get beyond that. We look at Greg Maddux. He threw an 88-mile-an-hour fastball. We assume he didn't. I mean, his pitiful body.
Very weak ones.
Yeah.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. One is directly to Marc Brown from Charlie Gardner. How could Northwestern be involved in a point-shaving scandal? They don't score enough when they try.
I mean, really, it was the most amazing point-shaving scandal ever, wasn't it?
Okay.
It was on both basketball and football. And that was, they were really bad in basketball, and I believe they'd actually had a good football. That was that Barnett.
Okay, I think. They were okay.
Yeah.
The only NCAA team ever to be caught point shaving in both football and basketball in the same year. And it is astounding, because to think that gamblers bet on a team that's going to lose by 30 and they'll throw the game and lose by 40, it's just astounding.
So the mid-'90s?
Yes, and for those people who think that we
97
just go
or
after
98.
Notre Dame, that we Northwestern guys, Morrissey and me, it's not true. We hammered, well, I know I did. I hammered the hell out of Northwestern back when they did that stuff. So we got our eye on Jim Phillips and Pat Fitzgerald, too.
Yeah, there you go. And, well, I can't say. All right, last question, and they're combined, Judy Turek and another mystery writer. Again, because it's a good question, we end with this. Why not allow athletes to take any drugs that they want? And Judy's part of it is, what do you think the future of this drug testing will be? So each of you take 1 minute to close.
All right. My thing, you got to think about kids, okay? So that's what I always get back to, kids. So if you allow all these guys to take drugs, steroids, whatever they're taking, and if we agree that there are physical effects, bad physical effects from taking them, what kind of message are you sending to kids? Kids are going to do whatever their heroes do, or some will at least, and I just think it's incredibly unhealthy and sends a really poor message to kids. And I know, and you know what? I've written this. In 30 years, we may be found out to be incredibly naive, that we're idiots and that drugs are fine. But right now, it seems to suggest that liver damage, heart damage are tied to steroid use. Why would you do it?
Mark, 1 minute.
You know, I am torn on this. I do feel that out there in the future somewhere, the attitude's going to change on this. And instead of having perfect testing, and it probably won't be for the better for society, but I do think it's just going to be wide open.
I think it's a war like the war on drugs that probably can't be won, but I think it's one that needs to be waged. Some things are moral, and we know that they're wrong. We can't stop it, but we attempt to. And I would say that looking at athletes who are using whatever they want, you would certainly have athletes who would succumb right there on the field or the court, because it would be completely wide open to anything. So we're behind. There'll always be the new Balcos, the new gurus in the science lab coming up with things that we can't even dream of. There'll probably be genetic engineering someday, but I do believe it's if you say it's wrong and you make sure it's wrong, it's good. And I'll bring up one last thing about the kids. Don Pearson, the great writer, old football writer for the Tribune, retired. But I remember talking to him, before my kids were very big, and I said, Don, does your kids actually care what athletes do? And he said, you know what, Rick, my son, and his kid's a great guy. He's now a lawyer. He's, completely wonderful young man, has his own kids. He said, he chews tobacco. He's 14. And why does he do it? Because Jim McMahon does. So, not that that's the greatest role model, but kids do look at these superior athletes. So I just think we can't ever allow it.
How about a nice round of applause? Gentlemen.
Hey, hey.